Okay, now we are moving on to Chapter 10 of the main text for this course, which is this qualitative inquiry and research design, choosing among 5 approaches. And we are going to talk about in specific the standards of validation and evaluation of qualitative research. So this text, of course, I've been mentioning this throughout, is a deep dive into qualitative research. The other textbook, which was not the primary text, but a suggested text, the Creswell 2014, is more of a compressed overview of qualitative, and mixed method design. So, that book is not a deep dive, and this book is definitely more thorough in looking at different approaches to qualitative research. So given that, we will quickly, go back and forth between types of validation, how you establish it, and validity and reliability, how you evaluate different stances on a qualitative research design. And so then that maps back to looking at the 5 approaches, and I'm not going to go in depth on those slides because really I feel that I'll highlight a few things, but I feel that if you end up picking a phenomenological or narrative design, then you should go back and look at the evaluation criteria for that design, that approach to qualitative research that you may be using. So looking at Chapter 10, once you get your committee together and start really fine-tuning your research methods, is something that you might want to look at and consider when you are looking at different methods in order to be able. As I always say, you have to pick the research methods that answer your research questions. And your research questions have to be tied into the purpose of your research. So that's like a backwards design model. You begin with your purpose, you develop research questions, and you select the appropriate research methods to answer your questions. It might be qualitative, it might be quantitative, it might be mixed methods. But what is going to answer your research questions is what should guide your selection of research methods. So Creswell highlights 5 perspectives on establishing validation for qualitative research: internal validity, external validity, and dependability, credibility, things that were talked about in the Gay-Mills overview of validation and reliability. But these nice charts tell you who the seminal researchers are for that area. So, and the types of perspective they use, and then the types of validation that it goes towards. So, we're not going to go through each of these now. This is just one perspective, and it's mostly a historical perspective. These are all seminal researchers in qualitative research. You can choose to pick one that would fit your approach to your qualitative research. All right. So in the sense of Lincoln and Guba, they talk about having authenticity of data, transferability, dependability. And so you can see that the Gay-Mills book really drew from Lincoln and the Guba model. So these are other perspectives on validation from the qualitative research literature that you could look at more closely when you write your methodology, if you are using qualitative research methodology. Lather, 1991, talking about the use of triangulation. And then we have our favorite guy, Creswell, who talks about looking at having these criteria of increasing your validation of your research findings, meaning how accurate are your findings, how accurately are they portrayed, how much extensive time in the field did you utilize to collect that data, were you descriptive, did you use a systematic process, did you use multiple validation strategies or data collection techniques? Some more validation strategies, again, prolonged engagement in the field, peer review or debriefing, looking at negative cases that might be the alternate case and to your research, the member check-in, using external audits, leaving an audit trail of your data as a result. But probably the top is triangulation, not necessarily the top. It's just the most systematic way of doing it. You might want to use more than one of these methods, and that would increase your validation, right? You could use triangulation. You can use peer review, member check-in, thick description, and external audits. And each of these pieces increase the validity of your findings. So you wouldn't just want to use one, in fact. That's how valid are the results for validity. For reliability, it's determining how accurately you're measuring or you're coding your data, or you're collecting your data over time and maybe over different participants. So it's about your data collection. How reliable is that? One way of doing that is if you use multiple coders, which you may not be using because you are executing your own dissertation project, but you might need member check-in, or you might want to use a peer review, and that would mean you have to have intercoder agreement. And I've talked and shared some examples in class of how we usually use 3 coders at my work research. You could still train someone to help code your information, and that would be increasing your reliability of findings, because your coders have to have agreement in consensus in how they go through the data and code. So that would be one way to increase the reliability of your findings. The next several slides talk about the evaluation criteria across the methods, and these are the ones that I was talking about in general for qualitative research, and then in specific for each of the 5 approaches. And I was only going to skim the 5 approaches. When you decide, if and when you do decide to use one of the 5 approaches, then you should go back and look at it more critically. So for some evaluation criteria, like why would I do this study, my qualitative study, what's important? This is that so what value, this idea that, okay, I have this research question, and what is it going to contribute to the field as a result of my research? Lincoln talks about, for understanding and validate, or some evaluation criteria to consider from Lincoln's perspective is, are you positioned within the community or the environment to do the research? What kind of voice are you going to give to the participants? What kind of reciprocal relationship exists between the researcher and the researched? Some evaluation criteria. Now we're going to get at that. Those were general evaluation criteria for qualitative methods, the last 2 slides we reviewed. This is evaluation criteria from the research literature across the 5 approaches. So for narrative research, Benson and Plummer are cited as seminal narrative researchers, and you want to look at, if you're doing a narrative approach to qualitative research, how is this individual that you selected perhaps for the narrative approach representative of that central phenomenon that you're trying to give, story to through a narrative research design? Are their accounts valid? And remember early on I used the example of the woman who lived in the Hill District during the 1920s into the 60s and into the early 1990s, and she was an African-American woman who became a nurse at a time where we know that education was not accessible to African Americans. Was she a good representation of that demographic to do narrative research for? That's one consideration you'd like to do to run your research through when you're evaluating it. How do you tell the story? We talked about this for the narrative research very early on. In fact, the first or second week of class, in which we said, how are we telling the story? From what perspective does the researcher tell the story in a narrative research design? You have to be very mindful of how you convey the story of others. For phenomenological research, here's some seminal researchers that you can look into if you're looking to take a phenomenological approach. What were the steps taken in the research process? What kind of structural connections did the researcher make between the phenomenon and the conclusions? Did they hold up? Creswell talks about conveying an understanding of philosophical tenets. Is the phenomenon concisely described or articulated? And does the author practice reflexivity in bracketing themselves and understanding their role as the researcher, the vehicle of research? I just want to mention here that at the end of your chapter are all the full citations within the textbook. So if you're looking at phenomenological approach, you can find the full citation, to all of these cited literature here. And in this case, these are seminal researchers for phenomenological research. So it is okay to cite and date a seminal researcher, and it's a couple 20 years old, over 20 years old, because it's a seminal for that field. It's representative, and you would expect for you to list some of the core seminal researchers within an approach to a research design that you are taking in your dissertation. So when thinking about ground, so we talked about, what did we talk about already? We talked about narrative and phenomenological. Now for grounded research, some evaluation criteria that from the seminal researchers for this approach, which is Strauss and Corbin. They talk about how your sample is collected. And remember, we talked about they have a very strict coding process. And when you're looking at using grounded theory, was it systematic? They have a very systematic process of coding and through coding, making these conceptual linkages and creating categories in order to build theory. So if you were thinking of taking a grounded theory approach, you want to investigate further Strauss and Corbin and look at their evaluation criteria for that type of qualitative research design. So we have two more to go through, right? Ethnographic and case study. Some more grounded theory. So this is, another seminal researcher, right? Which was outlined in the first couple chapters of this book. So maybe you don't look at maybe you're not following the coding strategy of Strauss and Corbin, but you want to do Charmes. And Charmes, maybe, if you recall, had more open process and flexible coding approach to grounded theory. So maybe Charmes is who you want to list as your seminal researcher in a grounded theory approach. So in Charmes, you would want to look at some of Charmes's publications and understanding how they define categories, how concepts are related through categories, how you use a iterative and more flexible coding process in trying to understand the phenomenon with a grounded theory approach. Creswell has published on grounded theory approach as well, and talks about, again, reflexivity, making connections between categories through a storyline. So there's another researcher that if you're taking a grounded theory approach, you might want to review Creswell. Now on to ethnographic and then case study. So of the 5 approaches, you could take an ethnographic approach, right? And that is looking at sort of a cultural phenomenon across a group. You typically take an ethnographic approach when you're looking at a cultural phenomenon. And here's some evaluation criteria that Spidler, who are the seminal researchers in ethnographic research, have outlined. One of the things that they list as a step is an evaluation, a step in the evaluation criteria is this native view of reality, like, because you're looking at a cultural group, right? So you want to look at their view of the world, their perceptions from their vantage point. That would be a criteria for doing an ethnographic research approach to your research. Creswell outlines identifying, you have to clearly identify a group that shares a culture, describe that cultural group, any themes within that cultural group. So these are all criteria to consider if you're using an ethnographic approach from Creswell. And then finally, in a case study approach to qualitative research, you want to make, follow or look into the seminal writings of Stake. And Stake outlines criteria that your case is easy to read. It contributes to understanding a whole. So the case is defined. I always say when you're doing a case run, you have to define the boundaries of the case. Is it one school district? Is it one building within a school district? You know, is it multiple buildings, but they share something that you define as the boundaries of related to your research question or your research purpose. So you have to define the boundaries of the case, and you do that, you know, according to Stake by following this criteria. And the next one, Creswell's criteria for a case study. It's a clear identified case or cases, so there's boundaries. It's clearly described. The themes relate to the case within the boundaries of the case. Any assertions or conclusions made come from the case. And a lot of times in qualitative research, people contextualize their findings as assertions. And sometimes that's because the generalizability is not great, usually in qualitative research. So this chapter really outlines several approaches that you could use as evaluation criteria if you were to select one of the 5 approaches to qualitative research. And that would establish more quality of your end product if you're following those seminal researchers for those approaches. This chapter also talked about strategies for validity and reliability and enhancing the results of your data. And then there's this one point here on intercoder agreement. You know, that is a strong consideration to make your qualitative design more robust, is by having multiple coders. So if you could do that in your research design, that would be increasing its validity and reliability of your results if you have multiple coders. So these are just some of the highlights from the chapter, and this ends this recording.